The man known to history as Alexander the Great of Macedon was born either on the 20th or the 21st of July in the year 356 BC. He was born in the city of Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon. Alexander's father was King Philip II of Macedon. He had succeeded to the throne of Macedon 3 years earlier and would begin a series of expansions of his kingdom which were hugely important precursors to Alexander's own accomplishments. Unlike his son, though, who would become known for his cultured rule as well as his conquests, Philip was the paragon of what the Greeks considered to be an uncultured barbarian from the northern limits of the Greek world. Alexander's mother was Olympias of Epirus, the daughter of King Neoptolemus of Epirus, an ancient kingdom straddling the borders of modern-day southern Albania and northwestern Greece. Though she was the fourth of either 7 or 8 wives that Philip took, Olympias was considered his senior wife, and Alexander seems to have been quickly established as his father's heir upon his birth, despite having a slightly older half-brother from one of his father's other marriages. There are numerous fables surrounding how Olympias gave birth to Alexander, one suggesting that her womb was struck by a lightning bolt during the consummation of her marriage to Philip, and that as a result, Zeus, the king of the gods and a deity associated with lightning, was actually Alexander's father. Alexander's life must be considered against the changing political background of not just the Kingdom of Macedon, but the wider Greek world and its relationship with the great Persian Empire in the 4th century BC. The Greeks, or Hellenes, as they termed themselves, had formed themselves into hundreds of city-states around mainland Greece and the islands of the Aegean Sea in centuries gone by. These city-states had then sent out colonies to establish new cities and towns in places as far afield as southern Italy and Sicily, Massalia in southern France, where modern-day Marseille stands, and around the Black Sea, in places like the coast of the Crimean Peninsula. Thus, although there was no centralized Greek state to speak of, and power was decentralized amongst hundreds of city-states by the end of the 6th century BC, the Greeks were collectively a very strong and rich people as a result of their social development, industry, and extensive trade. It was their wealth which led the nascent Persian Empire, which already ruled Persia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, the Caucasus, Anatolia, and Egypt, to try and invade and conquer the Greek mainland on 2 separate occasions in the early 5th century BC. Yet, on both occasions, and especially so during the second invasion in 480 BC and 479 BC, the Greeks had united against their common foe and managed to expel the invaders from their soil. This all pointed towards the strength of the Greeks, if they could be united under one ruler. In Alexander's time, that unifying power would be the Kingdom of Macedon. Macedon lay in what are today northern Greece and North Macedonia. It was considered to be on the northern periphery of the Greek world, and its inhabitants were rude, quasi-barbarians in the eyes of many Greeks in the urbane cities like Athens and Corinth. Nevertheless, the Argead dynasty, which emerged as the rulers of a Kingdom of Macedon here in the early 7th century BC, did absorb many elements of Greek culture over time. At the same time, their main political relations were with semi-nomadic groups such as the Illyrians, Molossians, and Thracians to the west, north, and east. Alexander's father, Philip, began a rapid period of expansion, reducing these tribes to the status of vassals or allies. He then turned southwards. Here, the Greeks had been weakened by the long Peloponnesian War that had pitted Athens and her allies against the Spartans and their many allies. When that conflict ended in 404 BC, after 27 long years of fighting, Athens was crippled as a power, and Sparta found itself triumphant. But even it was weakened by the fighting, and before long its hegemony over the Greek world was challenged by Thebes, the leader of the Boeotian League that won a great victory over the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Thebes still remained, but Philip would soon be on his way to building an empire that stretched from modern-day Albania northeast to the Black Sea and from modern-day Bulgaria south to the Peloponnese. There are 5 major sources for the life of Alexander the Great. The most detailed of these, by some margin, is the Anabasis of Alexander by Arrian of Nicomedia, a 2nd century AD Greco-Roman historian. This is a fulsome account of Alexander's campaigns against the Persian Empire and the powers further east in Bactria towards India. Anabasis means a march or journey. A near contemporary of Arrian's, the Greco-Roman historical biographer Plutarch, wrote a life of Alexander as part of his monumental series of biographies comparing the lives of eminent Greeks and Romans. Much is written of the life of Alexander and his conquests in a substantial section of the Bibliotheca Historica, or Library of History, which was written by Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian who lived in Sicily in the 1st century BC. Our 4th source is the Historiae Alexandri Magni, or Histories of Alexander the Great. This is the only full Latin history of Alexander the Great and his conquests written in ancient times to have survived down to the present day. It was written by Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian who lived in the 1st century AD. Finally, a 2nd century AD Roman historian, Marcus Justinus Frontinus, wrote an epitome of a now lost history of Alexander the Great, written by an earlier historian called Pompeius Trogus. All of these 5 sources suffer from being written in or around half a millennium after the time of Alexander the Great. However, we do know that they used sources which had been written much earlier, but which are now lost. Notably, a history of Alexander written by Cleitarchus, a Greek historian who lived in the time of Alexander and completed his history about 20 years after Alexander's death. Fragments of Cleitarchus's work are also extant through quotations in numerous other ancient texts, such as the geographical works of Strabo. With all of these works, as well as a mass of archaeological and material evidence, we can reconstruct Alexander's life quite substantially. We know much more about how Alexander was educated than we do for almost any other figure in ancient times. This is solely because he was tutored by the great Greek polymath and scholar Aristotle. Born in 384 BC, Aristotle had spent nearly 2 decades at the philosopher Plato's academy in Athens, a master who in turn had been taught by Socrates, before Aristotle accepted an offer from King Philip of Macedon in 348 BC to head to Pella to educate the crown prince Alexander. He arrived there in either 347 or 346 BC and became Alexander's primary tutor when he was 10 years of age. Given Aristotle's wide-ranging interests in everything from philosophy and political science to botany and biology, Alexander's education was broad. Aristotle also taught his young charge the Homeric cycles about the legendary Trojan War, and it was from these that Alexander developed his strong desire for military glory. Alexander took a copy of the Iliad that Aristotle had given him annotated in the margins with him on his Persian campaigns years later. This education was also important in Alexander's social development. He was taught alongside the sons of leading Macedonian nobles like Hephaestion and Cassander, individuals who he grew up with and who became his most trusted companions and generals in later life. We have an unusually large amount of detail about Alexander's personality and appearance, though the ancient accounts are somewhat contradictory. He was reputedly handsome, though short in stature, with Curtius Rufus suggesting that when Alexander sat on one of the great thrones of the Persian kings in later life, his feet did not reach the floor, and he had to order a footstool to be brought to disguise this fact. Most accounts suggest he had brownish blonde hair, though again there are some that suggest otherwise, with one even claiming that his hair had a reddish tinge to it. Portraits of him on coins, paintings, and sculptures were carefully curated to cast the Macedonian in the fairest light possible, but from these we can nevertheless determine that he had a straight nose, a firm protruding jawline, and fairly penetrating eyes. He was a cultivated young man, interested in the great writers of the Greek world, and yet also curious about the cultures of the people he conquered. But this was allied with a resolute brutality which saw him mass murder and enslave the inhabitants of conquered cities that resisted him. He patronized the arts and learning, was intelligent, though prone to stubbornness and emotional outbursts, a factor which was exacerbated by his fondness for wine, with several ancient chroniclers itemizing his heavy drinking bouts. His sexuality remains a mystery. Several passages in Plutarch's Life of Alexander could be interpreted as suggesting he was gay or bisexual, and his relationship with Hephaestion has elicited endless speculation. However, there is no concrete evidence to suggest what his sexual orientation was, one way or the other. One of Alexander's most enduring lifelong companions was his horse, Bucephalus. The horse's name derived from a scar or mark on one of its thighs, which resembled a bull. This was otherwise a large black steed with a distinctive white furrow on its brow in the shape of a star. Plutarch relates a colourful tale about how a horse trader came through Macedon around 344 BC when Alexander was 12 years of age. Bucephalus was shown to the Macedonian king, but he displayed little interest in purchasing a steed which seemed unruly and could not be ridden, while the trader was demanding an unusually high sum of 13 talents of silver. At this juncture, Alexander came forward and convinced his father to buy the horse if he could tame it and manage to ride it. This Alexander, despite his small size at the time, duly did, impressing his father in the process, who then bought the horse for his son. Bucephalus would go on to serve as Alexander's main horse for virtually the remainder of his life, nearly 20 years. The story, though, is quite probably an invention, one designed to mimic tales of the great Greek warrior Achilles and his prized steeds. By the time of his alleged taming of Bucephalus, Alexander was about to enter his adult years by the standards of the ancient world, an era which did not have the concept of adolescence, with people instead believing that children became adults when they reached their 13th or 14th year. His education under Aristotle continued down to around 340 BC, but he was also increasingly spending time being trained by his father in the rigors of government and war. He was considered sufficiently well advanced in this role that when Philip led a campaign against the Thracians around 340 BC, Alexander was left in charge of the government in Pella. A year later, he played a role in the military campaigns of the Fourth Sacred War, a short-lived conflict in 339 BC in which Philip used a sacrilegious act by the citizens of Amphissa to the south of Macedon as a pretext for imposing greater control over the region. This, in turn, led to an alliance amongst several Greek city-states against Macedon to try and resist the imposition of complete Macedonian rule over mainland Greece. Led by Thebes, Athens, and Corinth, the war culminated in the famous Battle of Chaeronea in the Boeotia region on the 2nd of August 338 BC. Alexander fought alongside his father at this engagement, in which the Macedonians won such a comprehensive victory that the resistance of the mainland Greek city-states was broken. A League of Corinth was formed thereafter, also known as the Hellenic League, as a federation of the Greek city-states bound together under Macedonian hegemony. A period of some unrest followed between Alexander and his father. During this, various matters became contentious between king and heir, and for a time, Alexander spent several months in self-imposed exile amongst the Illyrians. When he returned, a proposed marriage to the daughter of Pixodorus, a Persian governor of Caria in western Anatolia, was not agreed to by Philip and had to be abandoned. Given the fraying of the relationship between Philip and Alexander, and rumors that the king intended to bypass his son and make one of his half-brothers the new heir, it is unsurprising that when Philip was assassinated not long afterwards, suspicions arose that the incident may have been a palace coup. The killer was Pausanias of Orestes, one of Philip II's bodyguards and a trusted individual who had sufficiently close access to the king to carry out the deed, on the 21st of October, 336 BC. Pausanias subsequently fled and was hunted down and stabbed to death, precluding the possibility of any questioning or investigation to discover what his motives were and who else he might have been collaborating with. We have only one contemporary source for these events, a description by Aristotle, who claims that Pausanias acted alone and was motivated by having been offended by Philip's uncle-in-law, a man by the name of Attalus. Aristotle would have defended his young charge Alexander from any accusations of foul play in any event, and we may never know for sure if Alexander conspired to have his father murdered. What we do know is that any suggestions that one of Alexander's half-siblings might succeed Philip were now brushed aside. At 20 years of age, Alexander succeeded as King Alexander III of Macedon. With such a young and untested monarch replacing Philip, the ruthless warrior king who had expanded Macedon into a great power, many individuals and vassals were tempted to try and move against young Alexander. He proved more than capable of handling such threats. He had Amyntas killed, his cousin who had briefly ruled as king of Macedon as a child in 359 BC before being superseded by Philip, so as to stave off any threat in that direction to his rule. Several other Macedonian rivals were put to the sword. He then mustered several thousand Macedonian cavalry and commenced a swift campaign northwards against the Thracians, who had entered into revolt almost as soon as they learned of the assassination of Alexander's father. Thus did Alexander consolidate his control over Macedon and the southern Balkans, all while also handling the supposed depredations of his mother, Olympias, an overzealous mother if ever there was one, who, according to several accounts, ordered the murder of several of Philip II's children by his other wives, who might have posed a threat of any kind to Alexander's rule. Alexander's Balkan campaigns were simply a precursor to his much more ambitious design to conquer the Persian Empire. His father's role in this must be acknowledged. As early as the late 350s BC, Philip II had been supporting opponents of the Persians in Anatolia and Asia Minor, ancient names for what is now Turkey. There was also a strong Greek precedent for this, with the Spartans having launched numerous military expeditions half a century earlier against the Persian Empire, most notably the famous March of the 10,000 into the heart of the empire to interfere in a civil war which was underway there between 401 BC and 399 BC. Thus, Greek and Macedonian interference in Persian affairs was nothing new, but Alexander would not just seek to benefit from Persian weakness. Instead, he developed the vaulting ambition of conquering the entirety of the Persian Empire, something which he began preparing for from the moment that he ascended to the throne. It was for this reason that he dealt so brutally with any kind of resistance to his rule within Greece itself. When both Thebes and Athens also revolted against him not long after he ascended to the throne, he campaigned south and ordered the total destruction of the city of Thebes. He then divided its territory up among the neighboring cities of Boeotia. This done, Athens surrendered quickly. With the Greeks thus cowed, Alexander prepared to set off east to wage war on the Persians. It would result in one of the greatest military campaigns ever conducted. The Persian campaign would be fought by what is now termed the Hellenic Army, or Army of the Greeks. This integrated both Macedonian and Greek troops and differed considerably from traditional Macedonian fighting techniques that had largely relied on cavalry divisions centuries earlier. Instead, the new Macedonian fighting force, which again Philip was largely responsible for developing, relied on phalanxes. These were groups of heavily armoured infantrymen or hoplites that fought in well-ordered rectangular fighting divisions. Their main weapon was a long pike or spear known as the sarissa. Philip had introduced these to the Macedonian army. They were between 5 and 7 meters in length and were used at the front of the phalanx as a shield wall. The term phalanx derives from a word in Homer's Iliad which describes a tactical formation used by hoplite fighters. The phalanxes of massed hoplites carrying their enormous spears, were able to stop any charge of massed cavalry in their tracks and would pose a devastating threat to the Persians. It was with approximately 50,000 such troops, a corps of some 5,000 cavalry, a moderate fleet, and auxiliary forces that Alexander crossed over the Hellespont into Anatolia in 334 BC, just 2 years after ascending to the throne. These figures concerning the size of his army are disputed, and even the ancient sources did not correlate in reporting them, while it seems wholly evident that Alexander was reinforced continuously from Greece and Macedon in the years that followed. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Alexander and the Hellenic army were heavily outnumbered by the Persians. Alexander was the commander-in-chief of the army that headed off to conquer Persia in 334 BC. However, he had numerous generals that would be central to the campaign that followed. These were his companions, or hetairoi, as they were known in ancient times. Some of these were individuals who were Alexander's closest friends and allies, men he had grown up with only recently, like Hephaestion, Lysimachus, and Cassander, who were the same age as him and had been educated alongside him by Aristotle. Another was Ptolemy, a man around 10 years older than Alexander and rumoured by some to be an illegitimate child of King Philip II. Parmenion was a much older figure who had been a leading general of King Philip and represented continuity in the Macedonian army, as was the general Antigonus. Thus the companions, who also acted as the bodyguards, or somatophylakes, to Alexander in battle, were a combination of his closest childhood friends and also the leading military commanders of Macedon since the days of Philip II. The first stages of the Persian campaign were marked by the Battle of the Granicus River. This was near the waterway now known as the Biga River, which lies in northwestern Turkey and was not very far from where the Macedonians had made their landings in Anatolia after crossing the Hellespont. The engagement was fought here in May of 334 BC, though the exact date is not known. The central government in Mesopotamia and Persia, the two ancient names for Iraq and Iran respectively, had not responded in any major fashion to the Macedonian invasion by this time, and had been mired in a civil war for several years prior to the launching of Alexander's campaign, one which had seen their king, Artaxerxes III, assassinated in 338 BC and eventually replaced in 336 BC by Darius III, something which made the Persians all the more vulnerable. Hence, the Battle of the Granicus River was a clash between Alexander's forces and the local Persian ruler or satrap, Arcetes, and the men he had hastily assembled to face down the Macedonians. He was assisted by Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek commander from the island of Rhodes, who was allied with the Persians. At Granicus, the Persians were given a sobering taste of what lay ahead, with the massed Macedonian phalanxes inflicting a devastating defeat on them. Thousands of Persians and their allies were slain for the loss of just a few hundred Macedonians and Greeks, and the battle effectively left Alexander in control of Anatolia. The next year saw Alexander moving eastwards while consolidating control over Anatolia and Asia Minor. At the same time, Darius III was preparing his response and marched westwards. The two forces would meet in the second great battle of the Persian campaign, the Battle of Issus, on the 5th of November 333 BC. This occurred in the southeastern extremity of modern-day Turkey, near the borders with both Lebanon and Syria. Alexander's hand was forced here after Darius had wisely tried to outflank Alexander's army and cut off his supply lines. It was an engagement which far eclipsed the Battle of the Granicus River. Modern analysis of the ancient sources, which tended to exaggerate the size of the Persian armies and minimize the size of the Hellenic army, argue that Alexander probably brought about 35,000 to 40,000 men onto the field. Darius almost certainly outnumbered him, with perhaps between 50,000 and 60,000 men, though nowhere near the 500,000 or more men that Arrian and Plutarch claimed fought there. In the initial foray, the Persians had the better of the fighting, taking advantage of the terrain to force the Macedonian phalanxes to march uphill near a river. This resulted in an initial retreat, but at this juncture, Alexander led a fresh charge himself, during which he punctured through the Persian lines, leading a direct charge with his companions towards Darius and his bodyguards. This caused the Persian king to flee, an action which broke the Persian resolve and led to a mass flight from the battlefield. Many thousands of Persians and their allies were killed in the resulting rout as the Greeks and Macedonians pursued them from the field of battle. It was in the aftermath of the Battle of Issus that Alexander allegedly cut, or solved, the Gordian Knot. This Gordian Knot was a complex series of knots which had, allegedly, been used to secure an ox cart near the city of Gordium in Phrygia in Anatolia. According to local law, it had been tied there in ancient times by a peasant named Gordias, and nobody had ever solved the knot. Over time, it took on a religious overtone, and a local temple had come to surround it. As the account of Alexander's life and campaigns by Quintus Curtius Rufus tells us, the knot was comprised, quote, of several knots, all so tightly entangled that it was impossible to see how they were fastened together. Alexander, it should be noted, did not solve the problem of the knot. Instead, after briefly examining it and assessing the situation, he simply hacked through it with his sword, a blunt force solution to an intractable problem. Other accounts have Alexander simply untying the ox cart by removing a linchpin, thus rendering the knot superfluous. In any event, the parable is clear. The Macedonian was not to be prevented from reaching his goals by complex and seemingly intractable problems. He would push forward, using whatever means necessary to impose his will on Persia. After the Battle of Issus, King Darius and his armies pulled back towards Mesopotamia with the goal of organizing a stouter defense of the core lands of the Persian Empire there and in Persia itself. Alexander and his Hellenic army consequently faced little resistance as they pushed onwards. He decided not to strike directly towards the heart of Persia, but rather turned south into the Levant. This would result in the most protracted siege of the entire Persian campaign. In January 332 BC, the Greeks and Macedonians arrived to the city of Tyre, an ancient and wealthy port that had been one of the great centers of the maritime trade of the Phoenicians for centuries, a people who, like the Greeks, lived in decentralized city-states, but who had also made enormous contributions to the culture of the Mediterranean. The modern English alphabet, for instance, is indebted to the Phoenician alphabet, the first major consonantal alphabet ever devised. A 7-month siege of Tyre followed, one made difficult by the fact that the city walls were built in such a way as to almost make the city an island. This required a lengthy period in which siege towers, boats, and a maritime causeway were built in order to undo the defences and breach the city walls. According to Arrian, when the city finally fell to the Macedonians in July 332 BC, so enraged was Alexander with the delay in his campaign that he ordered the massacre of thousands of the inhabitants and the enslavement of the remainder, consisting of tens of thousands of mostly women and children. At this juncture, Alexander made a curious decision. It would have made sense to now proceed onwards to Mesopotamia and Persia to inflict a final defeat on Darius and the Persians. Instead, he continued his march southwards and now intended to pacify Egypt before resuming his clash with the Persian king. This was a dangerous move, one which left his flank exposed to counterattacks from Mesopotamia and even opened up the possibility that Darius would strike westwards into Asia Minor and Anatolia, sundering Alexander's land bridge back to Macedonia in the process. But Alexander was undismayed, buoyed by the surrender of numerous Phoenician and Canaanite cities throughout the Levant after the fall of Tyre, though the city of Gaza refused to surrender, leading to another bitter siege in which Alexander was wounded on the shoulder. Afterwards, he yet again engaged in a genocidal massacre of the population and sold the remainder into slavery. It was consequently with a fearsome reputation for massacring those who resisted him that Alexander arrived into Egypt in the autumn of 332 BC. The country, which had been under foreign rule anyway for centuries, surrendered to Alexander, while, for his part, he took steps to head immediately to some of the most venerated religious sites in the country, notably the temples to the gods at Memphis, near modern-day Cairo, where he made offerings in the Egyptian manner in order to win over the local population. Alexander would only spend a brief few months in Egypt, leaving again at the beginning of 331 BC to recommence the campaign into Mesopotamia. Still, his brief sojourn in the land of the Nile had a lasting impact. As he was progressing on his campaigns and conquering new territories, Alexander founded around 20 cities along the way, each of which was named Alexandria after himself. Several of these would never rise to become anything more than small towns, but the Alexandria that had been founded near the western edge of the River Nile Delta would be an incredible success story. In the decades that followed, as the Greek elites that emerged in Egypt began to rule the country from the north and away from the traditional centers of power further up the River Nile at Memphis and Luxor, and as trade and communication benefited from a northern port capital that was closely connected by sea to Greece and Macedon itself, Alexandria grew into a sprawling city. Moreover, under the patronage of the enlightened Ptolemaic monarchs here in the 3rd century BC, the Library of Alexandria was developed as the most extensive repository of knowledge in the ancient world, part of the wider mauseon of cultural complexes and temples in the center of the city. The city would also soon be home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the lighthouse of Pharos, built in the middle of the 3rd century BC on the small island of Pharos in the city's harbor. After the Battle of Issus, and as Alexander continued his campaigns into the Levant and Egypt, Darius had returned to the heart of his empire and tried to raise fresh armies while also sending peace overtures to Alexander. The latter became more and more desperate over time as Darius began to offer the Macedonians extensive territory in return for an end to the war. It was all to no avail, and on the 1st of October 331 BC, after Alexander and his army marched northeastwards for several months, they met with the Persians in the decisive clash of the war. The Battle of Gaugamela took place in the Kurdistan region of what is now northern Iraq. As ever, the ancient sources enormously exaggerated the size of the Persian army. While it was nowhere near the 1,000,000 men that Arrian described, it is probable that Darius had a horde of some 80,000 or 90,000 men, roughly twice the size of Alexander's force of around 45,000 men, which had been reinforced from Macedon and Greece after years of campaigning. In the end, superior military tactics, particularly the use of the phalanxes to break the Persian chariot attacks, won the day for Alexander. Ultimately, Darius lost the engagement in the weeks before it, and should have used the Macedonian advance through the desert with thinly stretched supply lines as an opportunity to make hit-and-run attacks on Alexander's forces that would have crippled them over time. Alexander now marched southwards into the heart of Mesopotamia, the great land dominated by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where some of the ancient world's greatest cities lay. With Darius and his followers having fled into Persia, many of the cities of Mesopotamia surrendered to Alexander and the Macedonians. He then moved eastwards towards Persia itself, a land which largely approximates to modern-day Iran, particularly the western half of the country. His goal was Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire in the Zagros Mountains. In January 330 BC, he won a considerable victory over a Persian army led by one of Darius's remaining commanders, Ariobarzanes, at the Persian Gate, a narrow mountain pass that was a natural defensive point located not far from Persepolis. With victory here, the route to Persepolis was largely cleared. The city was easily captured, and Alexander may have decided to burn it to the ground, though it remains unclear if the fire which destroyed much of it was accidental or not. With this, the Persian Empire had been all but conquered. Darius remained at large, fleeing ever further eastwards for a few months thereafter. However, he was soon murdered by Bessus, one of his former satraps in Bactria, the ancient name for Afghanistan. With his passing, the Persian royal line was declared to be at an end, and Alexander became ruler of all of the former lands of the Persian Empire. Alexander might have stopped at this juncture. He had achieved his ultimate goal, the conquest of Persia, a power that had threatened the independence of the Greek world, Macedon included, for 200 years. Surely the time was now right to move back westwards to Babylon and Mesopotamia and to begin consolidating his control over his vast new empire from its heartland. This was not what happened, though. Instead, Alexander told his men that they would continue eastwards. The lands here, Bactria and the Hindu Kush, needed to be pacified. They, too, had formed part of the Persian Empire from time to time, and Alexander wished to secure them rather than allowing the local rulers, like Bessus, to reassert their independence in the vacuum left by the collapse of Persian power. The Bactrian campaign of Alexander occurred between 330 BC and 328 BC. In undertaking this, he was leading his Hellenic army into lands which the Greeks and Macedonians knew a considerable amount about, but had never campaigned into in this manner. Clearly, there was some unrest amongst his followers at this decision. While travelling through Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, which was then known as the city of Markanda, one of Alexander's oldest companions, Clytus the Black, a Macedonian commander who had apparently saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the River Granicus years earlier, voiced his opposition to Alexander's recent actions at a drunken banquet. In response, Alexander threw a pike, or multi-pronged spear, at Clytus, striking him in the chest and killing him, an act which Alexander later regretted. Despite this sign of dissent, he pressed on eastwards afterwards, reducing Bactria to his rule and campaigning through the Hindu Kush. There he founded a new city, the forerunner of modern-day Kandahar. Having thus pacified Bactria, he also took Roxana, the daughter of a local ruler, Oxyates, as his first wife, an event which was celebrated with a considerable feast, though one which also aroused further concerns about Alexander's conduct amongst the Greeks and Macedonians. Here, Alexander was marrying for the first time at nearly 30 years of age, though to a woman from a very foreign land and with little knowledge of Greek and Macedonian customs, traditions, and social mores. After his campaign into Bactria and the pacification of the local lords and rulers there, many of his followers would have expected Alexander to turn back west to Persia and Mesopotamia. This, after all, was the eastern limit of where any power known to the Greeks had ever conquered. The Persians had exercised some considerable influence as far east as the western parts of modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, but no power from what we now call the Middle East, be it the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or anyone else, had ever ruled over lands any further to the east. In fact, very little was known about the world any further east towards the Himalayas and India. For instance, the 5th century BC historian, geographer, and social anthropologist Herodotus wrote about a land far to the east called India, a name derived from the Indus River, but for Herodotus, as for all Greeks up to Alexander's time, beyond the Indus River, which lies in northwestern India and along the border with Pakistan, was terra incognita, land which was unexplored and unknown. It is part of Alexander's legacy and mystique that he now decided to march onwards with his forces to India. Whether he wanted to simply explore lands which no Greek had before, at least that we know of, or whether he genuinely believed that he could conquer everything to the end of the world, remains a point of considerable debate. Alexander moved eastwards with upwards of 50,000 men in the second half of 327 BC. They headed into India through the Khyber Pass, though Alexander led a smaller contingent on a more northerly route to capture and fortify a fortress at Aeonus, near modern-day Piasar. This led the Greeks to the end of the Hindu Kush and into India proper. Here he was now heading into the territory of a local king by the name of Porus or Porus. who ruled over what is now the Punjab region of northern India. Here, in May 326 BC, Alexander and his army won yet another victory at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, the ancient name for the Jhelum River. Horus was captured in the clash, but it was a costly victory, and out of respect for the tactical nous of the Indian ruler, he reinstated him as a local vassal. This period was otherwise a traumatic one for Alexander, as his faithful companion, Bucephalus, died near the Hydaspes River. In honor of his long-serving steed, when he founded 2 cities by the banks of the river, Alexander ordered that one of them was to be called Alexandria Bucephalus. It wasn't only Alexander's horse that had reached the limits of its exertions. After defeating King Poros and nominally conquering the Punjab region, the Macedonians began to gather information about what lay further east. The information they acquired dismayed many. There was yet another great power lying there, what historians now call the Nenda Empire, a large state that controlled much of northern India east all the way to the Ganges River and the Bengal region. On learning this, and realizing that their exertions could go on forever if their king had his way, dissent began to brew amongst Alexander's men. As Plutarch tells us in his Life of Alexander, concerning the Macedonian soldiers, quote, "The struggle with Poros blunted their courage and stayed their further advance into India. For having done all they could do to repulse an enemy who mustered only 20,000 infantry and 2,000 horse, they violently opposed Alexander when he insisted on crossing the river Ganges, also the width of which, as they learned, was 32 furlongs, its depth 100 fathoms, while its banks on the further side were covered with multitudes of men-at-arms and horsemen and elephants. Alexander's eastward campaign and conquests were at an end. Realizing that his men would go no further, he turned back and headed for Persia and Mesopotamia. The march back westwards took nearly a year, and was actually one of the costliest aspects of Alexander's campaigns, as many men were lost traveling through the harsh environment of Central Asia, often passing through the territories of local rulers who had not been fully pacified. Alexander reached the city of Susa in western Persia near the modern-day border with Iraq in 324 BC. There he began a process of administrative reform and consolidation of his territorial conquests. Much of this concerned rewarding the veterans in his army and decommissioning many of the soldiers involved now that he had completed his campaigning. He ordered explorations of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and some of the earliest Greek accounts of the Arabian Peninsula date to the 320s BC. This was a precursor to a planned campaign into Arabia in years to come. Other reforms included new measures to acquire taxes and income from the provinces, while there were also steps taken by Alexander to appease his new subjects, notably by venerating the tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae, the resting place of the revered founder of the Persian Empire 2 centuries earlier. His time back in Persia, though, was marred by the death of his oldest friend, closest companion, and second-in-command, Hephaestion, from some local disease that resulted in a severe fever. Distraught, Alexander ordered an extensive period of mourning and numerous honors to be bestowed on his dead friend, with a magnificent funeral held that celebrated Hephaestion as a quasi-divine being. Not long before Hephaestion's death, Alexander had overseen one of the most striking acts of ethnic and cultural integration ever seen in the modern world. These have now become known as the Susa weddings. Through these, over 10,000 Macedonians and Greeks married Persian brides and women from the newly conquered countries. The idea was that these unions would lead to greater kinship ties between the conquerors and the conquered, and as their children would be ethnically mixed, the process of political, social, cultural, and ethnic integration would be rapidly advanced in the space of a generation. Alexander led by example, taking Stateira, a daughter of Darius III, as his second wife, and Parysatis, the youngest daughter of Darius's predecessor, King Artaxerxes III of Persia, as his third wife. Hephaestion married Statira's sister, Dripetis, and Alexander's other close companions and generals were also made to marry Persian and other foreign women of the conquered territories. Ptolemy, for instance, married Artacama, the daughter of King Artabasos II, the ruler of Phrygia in Anatolia. The Susa weddings were solemnized using Persian marriage rites. Arrian tells us that great gifts were given to each of the grooms as dowries from their new brides, but elsewhere we learn that as soon as Alexander died, the vast majority of the Macedonians and Greeks renounced the wives they had been married to at Susa in 324 BC, indicating a strong level of distaste amongst them for Alexander's methods of cultural integration. The Susa weddings were just one example of what many contemporaries perceived as a worrying trend in Alexander to rule more like an Eastern despot than as a Greek monarch. Ever since the Persian invasions of Greek territory began 2 centuries earlier, the Greeks had defined themselves in opposition to the culture of the Persians. Where the Persians worshipped their rulers like deities and had very little political freedoms, Greeks viewed themselves as a people who were much more individualistic and prioritized their individual liberties even where they lived under monarchs. Greeks and Macedonians, for instance, did not prostrate themselves on the floor before their rulers and kiss the floor like the Persians did when given an audience with their kings, a practice known as proskynesis. In many ways, these ideas of us and them when it comes to political culture have persisted down to the modern world, and European and Western people still view themselves as being different in fundamental opposition to the political cultures of places like Iran, Russia, or China in the East. In Alexander's day, many were consequently concerned by the adoption of Persian rituals at his court at Susa and Babylon and elsewhere in Persia and Mesopotamia, as well as his new tendency to dress like a Persian monarch and his integration of Persian officers and commanders into the Hellenic army. When a mutiny broke out at the town of Opis, near contemporary Baghdad, the mutineers cited Alexander's Oriental habits as one of the causes of the unrest. This growing disillusion with Alexander's methods of ruling after returning from India is important, for the great Macedonian ruler and conqueror was soon dead under somewhat suspicious circumstances. After returning to Babylon and announcing that his army would proceed south to conquer the Arabian Peninsula, he ordered a great banquet to be held in May 323 BC. Not long later, he developed a fever which worsened through the first week of June. Some sources attest that he then lost the ability to speak and eventually died either on the 10th or 11th of June 323 BC in the city of Babylon. Given his untimely demise and the manner in which he fell ill after a banquet in which much wine and food was consumed, theories abounded in ancient times, and have persisted ever since, that Alexander was poisoned. As we saw earlier, Alexander's own father died under suspicious circumstances, and there was a long-standing history of political murders amongst the Macedonian royals. There was also no shortage of reasons why someone might have conspired to kill him. Many were disillusioned at his style of rule, and the manner in which the Indian campaign had ended certainly points towards the army rank and file being unhappy at a potentially new, arduous campaign into the inhospitable Arabian desert. Ultimately, we will probably never know for certain whether Alexander died by chance or foul play in the summer of 323 BC. Alexander's body is understood to have been preserved in honey in a golden sarcophagus and sent back to Macedon, but it was intercepted along the way by Ptolemy, who ordered it to be taken to Egypt, a land where he was beginning to build his own power base. There he is understood to have first been buried at Memphis and later at a tomb in the city of Alexandria, though this version of events remains unsubstantiated and the remains of any such tomb have yet to be identified in modern times. Alexander's death at just 32 years of age created a huge succession crisis in an empire which had only just been built over the previous decade. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant at the time and would soon give birth to King Alexander IV of Macedon, the dead king's only legitimate child, though he may have had at least one illegitimate child born out of wedlock. However, it would be the better part of 20 years before this child would be able to rule in his own right, and such a newly created empire as the one Alexander had built in the 10 years before his death needed strong leadership in order for it not to collapse and revert to the rule of the local elites. Roxana demonstrated her ruthlessness in furthering the cause of her unborn child in quickly ordering the murder of Statira and Parysatis, Alexander's other 2 wives, shortly after their husband's death. Yet there was no agreement on who should serve as regent for the child when he was born, either late in 323 BC or early in 322 BC, or who might succeed Alexander in their own right. Instead, civil war erupted, with many of Alexander's closest companions and generals now trying to carve out their own principalities and kingdoms in various parts of his empire. The wars of the Diadochi being derived from the Greek word for crown princes, would ensue for the next 40 years, with Macedonian generals like Cassander, Perdiccas, Antipater, Ptolemy, and Seleucus, some of whom had been close companions of Alexander, and some of whom rose from relative obscurity in the aftermath of his death, all vying for hegemony. In the end, Alexander's empire would largely end up divided in 3. Cassander established himself as head of the kingdom of Macedon after Alexander's son and heir was assassinated. He and his successors would rule mainland Greece and the islands. Ptolemy founded a dynasty that would rule the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt for nearly 300 years thereafter, with their family also controlling parts of the Levant, Cyprus, and other territories for much of that time. Finally, the largest successor state to Alexander's empire was that claimed by a rather obscure figure, Seleucus. The Seleucid Empire consisted of most of the former lands of the Persian Empire in Asia Minor, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Persia, and east towards Bactria, although most of Alexander's most easterly conquests reverted back to the control of the local powers within a short time after his death. While Alexander's empire fragmented and his line died out quickly after his premature death, there is no doubting the significance of his conquests. These allowed for the spread of Greek culture throughout Anatolia, Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. The resulting era over the next 3 centuries is known as the Hellenistic period in the Eastern Mediterranean. During it, Greek culture blossomed in the many cities Alexander had ordered the creation of in the lands he conquered. Above all, Alexandria in northern Egypt, as the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, became the center of the Greek world, an enormous metropolis that had become the greatest center of learning and knowledge the world had ever seen up to that time. In the 3rd century BC, figures here like Euclid and Eratosthenes made incredible breakthroughs in various scientific fields while studying at the Library of Alexandria, which laid the groundwork for much of the disciplines of geography, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic for centuries to come. Indeed, even centuries later, at the height of the Roman Empire, Alexandria remained the 2nd largest city of the empire and the educational and intellectual capital of it. So successful was the spread of Greek culture around the Eastern Mediterranean and into the Levant following Alexander's conquests, that while the Romans might have conquered the successor states of Alexander's empire in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the Romans basically absorbed Greek culture, and Roman society was transformed by it over time. Of course, Alexander's legacy was great thereafter. From his own time onwards down to modern times, military commanders and would-be conquerors have always looked up to Alexander as a paragon of military brilliance. The vast Alexander mosaic depicting Alexander charging against King Darius at the Battle of Issus, located in the House of the Faun in Pompeii in southern Italy, has survived sufficiently intact down to the present day to indicate that wealthy Romans had extensive mosaics of Alexander installed in their villas. This one measures nearly 3 meters by more than 5 meters. Julius Caesar idolized Alexander, while his great-nephew, Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, visited the putative tomb of Alexander while in Egypt. The very fact that the main sources for Alexander's life were written in Roman times attests to the abiding fascination in the Macedon king. In later times, some Muslim writers reworked the tale of Alexander's life to have him visit Mecca, while several medieval and early modern rulers of parts of India adopted the title Sikandar, which is derived from the Persian version of the name Alexander. Perhaps the ruler who most idolized Alexander the Great, though, was Napoleon Bonaparte. His Egyptian expedition, launched in 1798, in which he ultimately planned to march overland through Central Asia to attack British India, was designed in part to emulate Alexander's Persian and Indian campaigns. Alexander the Great was unquestionably one of the most consequential figures in ancient history. For centuries, Macedonia had been a peripheral part of the Greek world, the inhabitants of which were considered little more than barbarians by the more urbane Greeks of cities like Athens. But Macedonia had risen to great heights through the conquests and wars waged by Alexander's father, Philip II, a ruler whose role in these events should not be understated. Building on his father's achievements, Alexander undertook an incredible series of military conquests from the mid-330s BC. For centuries, Mesopotamia and Persia had been the region where powers like the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians emanated from to conquer vast parts of the known world. Alexander was the first individual to turn that dynamic on its head, coming east from the Mediterranean to conquer the entire Persian Empire in little more than half a decade. Then he went further, marching onwards with his armies to the edges of the known world in India. One wonders how much further he might have gone had his followers not simply refused to campaign any further east. Though he died not long after, Greek culture was spread extensively to new lands as a result of his actions, and vast parts of Eurasia were changed forevermore. Alexander's reign might not have been peaceful or long, but if rulers acquire the title the Great in response to changing history and the world, then few figures deserve the sobriquet more than Alexander the Great. What do you think of Alexander the Great? Was he an enlightened despot who spread Greek culture far and wide to the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond in Central Asia? Or was he simply a warlord whose sole objective was conquest and his own aggrandizement? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you